All right, so we're recording. So it's 11:08. Hopefully you don't hear the gardeners in the background. They are out there, but hopefully you don't hear them. Anyway, again, if you have questions, just type your questions into that banner at the top. So if you open that URL, slides.app.goo.gl, you'll be able to ask questions, okay? But today we are going to try and get through this entire portion of lecture. There's a couple videos involved. There's a couple different things. So I encourage you, take notes if you want. Just watch if you want, but make sure you're paying attention. Ask questions if you have them. I have the questions open. So as you ask them, I will be able to see them. And yeah, all right. So here we go. So we are talking today about the Cold War heating up. We're looking particularly at the fall of China to communism and the Korean conflict. We've talked about this, why I call it the Korean conflict, not the Korean War. We'll talk about that more when we get there today. All right, so here we go. Just as a reminder, this was the class definition we came up with for what a Cold War is, right? So this is the one that as a class you guys made. I put it in here just to remind you, so take a second, read it. This is just to refresh your memory of what we're calling a Cold War. All right, so let's go. All right, so part one, China becomes a communist nation. So something you have to know is prior to World War II, there was a civil war that broke out in China between the Chinese nationalists, so those that were part of the imperial system. They followed the emperor of China, and they'd been part of that dynastic system. These are the Chinese nationalists, and they were fighting against the communists. So we'll look at the nationalists first, and then we'll look at the communists. Okay, so the nationalists are led by a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. That's him down there in the lower right corner. And they were supported during their civil war by the United States. So the United States, during the Civil War and during World War II, gave the Chinese nationalists about $3 billion in aid. We supported them because we don't like communists, right? Even though under Chiang Kai-shek, we knew that the government was weak, we knew that it was inefficient, that he was pretty corrupt, that he brought in a lot of his friends to his government and gave them jobs just based on the fact that they were his friends or whatever. And so that's Chiang Kai-shek. The other issue is, like the rest of the world, during this time, they got hit by the Great Depression as well. And so they were hampered by extreme inflation and a failing economy, just like the rest of the world, right? And so they begin to lose the people's support, the Chinese people's support, in 1944. And the event that really kicks that off is much like in the Russian Revolution, where the Tsar opened fire on his people. Chiang Kai-shek ordered the secret police to open fire on Chinese citizens who were protesting a 10,000% increase in the price of rice. So 10,000% increase in the price of rice seems like a fair thing to be able to protest, especially if rice is a staple crop. It's one of your main, not only one of your main crops that you're producing and trying to sell if you're a Chinese farmer, but it's also one of the main things that your family is going to be able to eat, especially during times of a failing economy and inflation. So he orders the secret police to open fire on them, and the people begin to question really their loyalty to these nationalists. In addition to that, he's in the middle of fighting a civil war against the Chinese communists. And the Chinese communists are led by a gentleman named Mao Zedong. That's him there in the top right. That other picture is a picture of Mao with, hopefully you recognize him there, Joseph Stalin. And they rely heavily on the Soviet Union. That's why there's a picture of him with Stalin. He relied heavily on the Soviet Union to provide him with supplies, with money, with backing during this war. And really, I hope you're seeing the tensions here. So even the Chinese Civil War is really another proxy war of the United States versus the Soviet Union. But their civil war is put on pause during World War II, right? And we've talked about this phrase, a marriage of convenience, before. We talked about it mostly when we talked about during World War II, the relationship between Stalin and Hitler, that it was a marriage of convenience. Again, this phrase meaning that, you know, they're friendly because they have a common goal, but they don't actually like each other, right? And so during World War II, the nationalists and the communists are going to come together to repel Japanese invaders. We talked about this during our World War II unit. Japan, one of the first things they do is they invade China. They invade Manchuria and then other portions of mainland China. And so during World War II, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek are able to kind of put aside their differences, push pause on their war, and they're going to push out the Japanese. But as soon as the Japanese retreat, the Chinese Civil War is back on. And it is renewed with vigor. The U.S. attempts to mediate the conflict, but at the same time, while they're mediating the conflict, they're providing the nationalists with about $2 billion worth of military equipment and supplies, but no troops. So I don't know how much you guys know about mediation, but mediation is a term often used in the legal world, right? So I think we all think that whenever somebody sues somebody, it goes to court. Oftentimes it doesn't go to court. Most of the time it doesn't go to court, actually. Oftentimes it's settled outside of court. And especially in civil cases, right? So somebody suing somebody else for money. A lot of them end up in what's called mediation, where there's kind of this neutral mediator who's there to kind of try and negotiate the best deal for both sides. And so they listen to one side, go talk to the other side, give them some information, let them know what the other side said. They come back to the other side with an update, and they keep going back and forth like that. The only way mediation works is if that mediator is truly neutral. But the United States is clearly not neutral. They're supporting the nationalists with $2 billion worth of military equipment and supplies. And so it never works, right? The United States is not able to get them to mediate this conflict. But the big deal here is that the United States does not send troops. Remember, we already talked about the fact that the policy of the United States at this time is containment, right? The goal was to contain communism at all costs, to contain the spread. And so if the goal is containment at any cost, you would think that the United States would be willing to send troops. But the reality is that President Truman is not willing to send troops. He only sends military equipment and supplies. He sends a lot of them, $2 billion worth, but he's not willing to send troops. And that's going to come back to bite him when, in May of 1949, Mao and the communists take over mainland China, and they establish the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. Then, as a result, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists are forced to flee to the island of Taiwan, where they establish the Republic of China. So, as the visual shows, the giant red portion with the communist Chinese flag, that is mainland China. That is the main portion of China. That is the PRC. That is the government that is still in existence today. If you were to go look up the government of China today, it's still the PRC, the People's Republic. And the island of Taiwan is still the Republic of China. Now, here's the deal. The name, the People's Republic of China, implies, if you read it, you would assume it was democratic. It's not. It's a communist government run by the Communist Politburo. Mao is the leader of the Chinese Communist Party at the time. Mao is the dictator of China. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China over in Taiwan, they are on paper a democratic republic with the backing of the United States, but the reality is that it too is a dictatorial government. Chiang Kai-shek is absolutely running the island of Taiwan like a dictator. Now, here's the other thing you need to know. The United States is not going to recognize Mao's government. okay? So according to the United States, I'm going to go back a slide. According to the United States, that giant red portion is no longer China. If you were to ask the United States government in May of 1949, where is China, and you gave them a map, the US government is going to point to the island of Taiwan and say, there is China. Okay, keep that in mind. That's important. Legitimacy for a government is important. You need other governments to recognize your country as legitimate. And right now, the United States, at the time, the biggest world power, is saying that that giant portion that used to be China is no longer the official China. Okay, so they're going to refuse to recognize Mao's government. And in fact, the United States government refuses to recognize Big China, if you will, as the real China until January of 1979. Jimmy Carter is finally going to recognize the People's Republic of China as China in 1979. Okay, until then, or up, from 1949 to 1979, for all 30 years, right? If you ask the US government where China is, they would point to the island of Taiwan, okay? And Congress is going to blame President Truman for the communist takeover of what used to be China, right? The large mainland China. They're going to blame President Truman because, again, he didn't send troops, right? Congress calls this an avoidable catastrophe, right? They consider containment a complete failure because Truman failed to send troops. Clearly, he wasn't up to the task. And they start questioning whether Truman's administration was sympathetic to the communist cause. In other words, did he not send troops on purpose because he likes communism? Now, the reality is he doesn't like communism. He's not trying to allow China to become a communist country. He's just trying not to get into another war, is really what it is. And this theme of trying to avoid, for lack of a better term, World War III is a common theme throughout this whole lecture. So keep that in mind as well. All right. Congress, if they, Republicans at the time definitely think Truman is sympathetic to communism, and their fears are exacerbated or made worse by what's going to come in Korea, which we're going to talk about in a moment, okay? And so as a result, Truman has to respond, right? He can't look weak. He can't appear to not know what's going on. He can't appear to be, sympathetic to communism. So he and the National Security Council come up with this document, NSC 68. We're going to read this on Wednesday. We'll read some portions of it, not the whole thing. The whole thing is like 128 pages or something like that. We're going to read like 4. But this document, you need to know this document. NSC 68 stands for National Security Council, document number 68. Very creative title, I know. April 14th, 1950 is when this is made, and it basically becomes the blueprint for the Cold War, right? This is going to set the tone for how we are going to fight from 1950 to 1990, right? If you remember, I told you the Cold War doesn't end until 1991, and so this is going to be our blueprint for fighting, and it calls for total war, total Cold War. All areas of life are now focused on the war effort, okay? So if you remember the phrase total war from World War II, from World War I, right? It's when our entire country focuses its effort on war. We do whatever we have to do to make war. We stop making cars, we start building tanks. We stop making, skyscrapers, we start building airplanes, right? Whatever it is, we have to do it. And NSC 68 makes this statement about the Soviet Union. It says that the Soviet Union is animated by a new fanatic faith, antithetical to our own, and that they seek to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world, meaning that the Soviet Union, Stalin, and the communists, they are just absolutely opposed to everything that's American. They don't believe in anything we believe in, and in fact, they are set up as our enemy. and that this is going to continue, and we are now at war again with their ideology. If you go back to our definition of a Cold War, this seems to line up, right? And NSC 68 really sets the tone going forward, okay? And the first test of NSC 68 is going to be the Korean War. Now, I'm going to take a second and I'm going to pause the recording here, okay? And we'll see how we're doing. So we're going to pause the recording. All right, so we are back. All right, I'm going to take a minute and just explain again why I put like an asterisk next to Korean War, why in the beginning it said Korean conflict. And so I want to remind you of a couple things. Number one, this is an academic conversation, right? We're in class, even though we're not in class. And so when we talk about the Korean War, we talk about it differently in an academic setting than you would out in public. So if any of you know any Korean War vets, it's probably based on your parents' ages, it's probably going to be like your grandparents might have been Korean War veterans, maybe great-grandparents. Anyway, if you know any Korean War veterans, I would never tell you to walk up to them and say, hey, you didn't fight in a war, right? I'm not saying that they didn't. I've said this before, but they still deserve all the accolades and honor. And the Korean War specifically is actually usually called the Forgotten War. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, because it's fought so close to World War II, people forget that it was its own war. And then two, when they came home from fighting, they didn't really win, so nobody really wanted to talk about it. So nobody did, and so it got kind of forgotten. But the reason I call it the Korean conflict, or I call it, I put Korean War with a little asterisk there, is because number one, it was not a declared war. We never declared, as a country, the United States never declared war against North Korea or anybody else involved in this fight. It's a United Nations conflict. We'll talk about that in a second. And so as a result, there is no declaration of war. We have not declared war since World War II as a country. Again, I'm not telling you to walk up to an Iraq or Afghanistan veteran and say you didn't fight in a war, because they absolutely fought in a fight. Whether or not it's a technical war is besides the question, right? That's a matter for academics to debate about and argue about. That's not to take away from their military service, okay? So just keep that in mind. I'm not advocating that they're not soldiers. I'm not advocating they didn't fight in war, or that this wasn't a real fight. It's just on paper, technically, this is not a war, right? And we need to keep that in mind, because the fact that it's not a war fits into the fact that this is part of the Cold War, right? It's these proxy fights. It's these fights that we aren't really in. We aren't really putting our whole efforts into, right? Total war in the sense of World War II, right? Total war, we changed everything. All industries stopped. We put everything to the war, right? Again, we stopped making cars. We started building tanks or airplanes, right? We don't do that. Most of the country doesn't even know we're fighting in Korea while we're fighting there. Lives are going back to the pre-World War II normal, right? So that's another big reason, is that if this is a war, we would want to say that we would expect that the United States would respond the way they responded to all other wars. They go in full blast and they're in it, but that's not the case in Korea. Okay, so let's dive in. So yeah, here we go. All right, so Japan had occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945. So they were running Korea 1910 to 1945, okay? And as a result, right, they're there during World War II, right? If you remember your World War II timeline, they're there. And so what's going to happen is, near the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States are going to come through and they're going to liberate Korea. In 1945, right? At the end of World War II, the Soviets and the Americans, they're going to go and they're going to free the Korean Peninsula. I'm going to go back real quick. If you look on the map here, right, Korea is this peninsula down here, right? So all of this is Korea. This is China, right? Korea, China, Japan. All right. And so the Soviets are going to come from the north while the Americans enter from the south. Okay, and they're going to work their way to the middle at the 38th parallel. This 38th parallel is very important. It's going to be important the entire time. Okay, so the 38th parallel is where they meet up, somewhere near the middle. Okay, and just like in Germany, once the Soviets and the Americans have taken control from the Japanese, they're going to establish occupation zones in their respective halves. So from the 38th parallel down, the Americans are in control. From the 30th parallel up, the Soviets are in control. And just like in Germany, they're going to move to create governments there. But the Americans are going to stay in the south, and they're going to have a military presence there in control, and the Soviets are going to stay in the north and have a military presence there. So that's why I say liberation was really only from the Japanese. Korea was still not independent. They still weren't free. That's why I put liberation in air quotes. They're really not liberated. They're not free, right? Here's some pictures of that liberation. These are American soldiers confiscating weapons from Japanese soldiers. And then you can see on the map here, that 38th parallel, right? And you can see the northern portion and the southern portion, okay? And so what's going to happen is just like in Germany, again, we've seen this in Germany, right? They're going to split Korea. So August 1948, they're going to form the Republic of Korea, or what we now know as South Korea, right? It's established under the leadership of a man named Syngman Rhee, and the U.S. forces are still there, right? They established the capital at Seoul, which is where that green star is, right? And it has a democratic government, okay? North of the 38th parallel, in September of 1948, the Soviets form the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK, North Korea, right? Both of these governments still exist today. We'll talk about that in a minute, right? But North Korea, or the DPRK, is established under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. He's the grandfather of Kim Jong-il, or Kim Jong-un, whichever one is the current one. Kim Il-sung, and they are supported by the Soviets. Their capital is at where that yellow star is, at Pyongyang, and they are a communist totalitarian government. Okay, so you now have these two Koreas, where there used to be one Korea, now there's two, North and South. Okay, and nobody's super excited about that. There's nothing special about the 38th parallel other than it's kind of sort of in the middle, and that's where the Americans and the Soviets met up. That doesn't mean that there was any defining difference there at the 38th parallel. Families and villages were divided by this line. So when South Korea and North Korea are formed, it separates families just because they happen to live on opposite sides of this line, right? And the word arbitrary just means that it's random. It doesn't have a meaning. This arbitrary divider ends up dividing families, communities, for no reason other than that's where they met, right? And so many Koreans, North and South, want a unified Korea. They want one Korea again, and they aren't happy. And so Kim Il-sung, right, if you remember, he's the leader of North Korea. He wants to invade South Korea to unify the peninsula, right? He wants a communist government, but he wants one Korea, and he wants it all to be communist. And he goes to the Soviets, right, because they back him, and he says, hey, I want to invade South Korea. And the Soviets are like, no, we can't do that. The Americans are still down there. But by June of 1949, there's less than 500 American troops still in South Korea. And so Kim Il-sung goes back to the Soviets and says, can I please invade now? And Stalin's response is that he tells Kim Il-sung in 1950 that if he can get Mao in China on board to back him, then he can go ahead. And this is one of those interesting moments in history where we have a document, that we have a record of Stalin telling Kim Il-sung this. We have the letter that he wrote that says if Mao comes on board and backs him, that, you know, North Korea can go ahead and invade South Korea. But what we don't have record of is a response. We don't have any record of whether Kim Il-sung actually reached out to Mao. We don't have a response from Mao. All we know is that in June of 1950, North Korea invades anyway. And they take over Seoul, right? They immediately take the capital of South Korea. The South Koreans are immediately forced on the run. They run south, and they immediately seek the intervention by the UN. So they reach out to the United Nations, and they ask them to intervene. Well, if you remember the way that the UN works, there's the UN Security Council, right? And the UN Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members. We talked about this when we talked about the formation of the United Nations. Those 5 permanent members are Great Britain, France, the United States, the Soviet Union, and who am I missing? This is embarrassing. I'm going to definitely edit this part out. Who am I missing? Great Britain, France, Great Britain, France, the United States. Oh, and China. Duh. I'm an idiot. China, right? So it's the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. Okay, those are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And if you remember, if any one of them vetoes anything, then it's a permanent veto. It doesn't matter if the other 4 or the other nations say yes. If one of these permanent 5 veto it, it's vetoed. So South Korea reaches out to the UN, and they ask the UN to intervene. Now the problem is the Soviets are boycotting the UN because, like I said, the United States does not recognize the People's Republic of China as China. They view the Republic of China, or Taiwan, as China. So on the Security Council, who is seated? It's Great Britain, France, the United States, Taiwan, and the Soviets. And the Soviets are not okay with that because they say that Taiwan is not China. Mao's PRC is China. And so they boycott the United Nations, and they say that they're going to boycott until Mao's China, the PRC, is allowed in, right? And so as a result, the Soviets aren't there. With no representative from the Soviet Union present to veto this move, the UN Security Council, being Great Britain, France, the United States, and Taiwan, they vote to support South Korea. So, to make this clear, this is a UN effort, not an American war. Okay? A UN effort, not an American war. And the United Nations cannot declare war, therefore there is no declaration of war from either side. What ends up happening is 16 nations, the nations of the United Nations, end up sending 520,000 men to go fight. Now, 90% of these are American, which is why a lot of people consider this an American war or mistake it for an American war. We sent the bulk of the soldiers, but it's not an American war. The other thing that makes people think it's an American war is that it's led by General Douglas MacArthur, the Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command. If you remember, General Douglas MacArthur was also the Commander-in-Chief of the Army during the Pacific Campaign during World War II, right? He's the guy, gets kicked out of the Philippines, says he's going to return to the Philippines, all that jazz, right? And so, again, a UN effort, not an American war, but it is led by General MacArthur, okay? And this is where this stuff starts getting crazy. So here we go. By September of 1950, North Korean forces had not only taken the capital of Seoul, but they had pushed the South Korean and UN forces back to this tiny little spot on the edge of the peninsula called Pusan, okay? And so when General MacArthur arrives, that's where they're at. They're in Busan. They're pushed back all the way to the edge of the peninsula. It's not looking good. And so MacArthur comes up with this idea of a 1-2 punch to turn the tide of the fight, right? Step one, he's going to launch a ground counterattack right there, right on the ground, the way we normally think of war, with tanks, heavy artillery, and a fresh supply of American troops, right? They're just arriving, they're fresh, they're full of energy. The second thing he's going to do is he's going to launch an amphibious assault at Incheon. Now, amphibious assault means that it's coming from the water, right? He's using the Navy. And Incheon is behind enemy lines. Incheon is near Seoul, okay, which is clearly behind enemy lines, right? The North Koreans had advanced that far already. And so what he's trying to do is he's kind of trying to cut them off and sandwich them, right? And so this next map will show you. So you can see there's Incheon, right? So they're starting from Busan, right? They're going to launch a ground attack here. They're going to bring soldiers over through the water. They're going to sail up to Incheon, and they're going to cut them off, okay? And so his 1-2 punch is an absolute success. Half of the North Korean troops flee back across the 38th parallel. So those that were at Incheon or north of there, they're going to flee back across the 38th parallel when the Americans and the UN forces arrive. The other half, though, are trapped, right? Those that got sandwiched between Incheon and Busan. They're trapped and they surrender, okay? Keep that in mind. This large portion of North Korean soldiers are now prisoners of war, and they're going to be held by the UN forces, okay? Well, General MacArthur is not one to sit around. He's not okay with just being okay. So he orders his troops to push the North Korean troops back, to follow them as they run back across the 38th parallel. So he pushes them back. He takes their capital, Pyongyang. He pushes them all the way back to the Yalu River, which is this river right up here. And as you can see, the Yalu River is the border between Korea and China. Okay, so MacArthur has not only pushed back and taken what was South Korea, right? All this portion south of the 38th parallel. He's pushed into North Korea, and he is now at the border of China, okay? And he's facing a dilemma. What do you do now, right? Do you push them back into China? Do you push them up to their border with the Soviet Union? If you can see up here, I think you can see my mouse. You should be able to, right? But the Yalu River flows right here, right? Flows out to the ocean here. But up here, here's China. The Soviet Union's this little sliver here, right? It has this portion of land here, and then here's Korea. So it has a common border. Do you push into China? Do you push to the Soviet Union? Or do you just stop and do you settle here and take over this land? Well, before MacArthur can decide what he's going to do, China responds in November of 1950. So Mao and the communists, they like having communist North Korea there. It creates a buffer for them, right? If you remember, I'm going to go back so you can see the map. If you remember, Manchuria, or China, has been invaded quite a bit by the Japanese. It got invaded by the Soviets before they were the Soviets, back during the Russian Civil Wars, right? It gets invaded quite a bit. So they're okay. Mao's pretty happy having this buffer state of communists between them, right? He likes it. He's pretty happy about that. So he would like to keep that. But the other piece of this is that now that MacArthur and the UN forces and the US Navy have pushed all the way to the Yalu, the US Navy's right off his shores, and he doesn't feel comfortable with that. He feels worried, he feels vulnerable about that. And so Mao decides he has to engage, otherwise this is not going to end well. So China ends up sending 300,000 troops to join the war on the North Korean side. And at this point, it's key. We have to recognize that this war is no longer a Korean Civil War. It's an international fight between China and the US being played out in Korea, right? This is basically the US versus China in Korea. And all of it is still a proxy fight for the real fight that's happening between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? We've talked about this. This is part of our definition of Cold War, these proxy fights, right? So when the Chinese join, they are able to overtake the UN forces, and they're going to push the UN and South Korean forces back. They're forced to retreat, and they retreat back basically across the 38th parallel, right? You can see this dark black line is the battle line now. It's not a perfect line through the 38th parallel anymore. It's kind of, it goes a little bit above it. But even then, the North Korean and Chinese forces managed to cross that and take Seoul again. They take the capital of South Korea again. Okay? And MacArthur's not happy about this, right? So in early 1951, MacArthur requests permission to use an atom bomb. He wants to drop a nuke in China to break the stalemate, because he thinks if he drops a nuke in China, the Chinese forces will stop helping the North Koreans because they'll be forced to retreat back and go help their own people, right? Because they just got a nuke dropped on them. And so he requests to use the nuke, and Truman says no, right? He says no because he says that this is likely to start World War III, right? He cites the Soviet Neutral Assistance Pact, where basically the Soviets have agreed that if the Chinese get nuked, they'll jump in. And so he knows that nuking China is going to bring the Soviets in and basically start World War III, right? And so instead, Truman orders the U.S. 8th Army, led by General Matthew B. Ridgway, that's him up there in the top right, to retake Seoul and push the North Koreans back across the 30th parallel. And he does. Matthew B. Ridgway and the 8th Army are very successful. They push the North Koreans out of Seoul, and they push them back to that stalemate line. Well, MacArthur's not happy. MacArthur wants full-scale war against China, right? That is his solution to this problem. He is not satisfied with just Korea. He wants the bigger picture. He wants China. So he goes over Truman's head. He starts reaching out to newspapers and magazine owners back in the United States. He also reaches out to Republican congressmen, because remember, Truman's a Democrat. And he starts telling them his plan, that he needs to take out China, and that Truman's not letting him, and that, you know, he's a war hero and Truman's just not going, he's ignoring him, right? And MacArthur is popular. MacArthur's a World War II hero, right? The guy walked through the Pacific, right? We hail him as a hero. And so he's insanely popular at home. And when all of this stuff starts coming out that he is wanting to, you know, take this war full scale, the public backs him. Okay. I'm going to play this clip. I'm going to play a little bit of it. This is a real song, right? Called When They Drop the Atomic Bomb. And it's by a group, that's their real name of the band, Jackie Dahl and his Pickled Peppers. So take a listen.
I propose the President of the United States advise the commander of the North Korean troops to withdraw his forces beyond the 38th parallel within 1 week, or use that week to evacuate civilians from a specified list of North Korean cities that will be subjected to atomic attack by the United States Air Force. There will soon be an end to this cold and wicked war. When those hard-headed communists get what they're looking for, only one thing that will stop them, and they're a ferocious bunch. If General MacArthur drops a atomic bomb, they'll be fired just in the middle, flying all around, and the radioactivity will burn into the ground. If there's any commies left, they'll be all on the run. If General MacArthur drops a atomic bomb. I ask you, the American citizen, to let your congressman know how you feel about this proposal.
Okay, so This is terrible, right? He'll have the commies all on the run. Radioactivity is going to burn them to the ground. This is a real song, real group that come out in support of MacArthur. And if you're Truman, you now have your top general in this fight undermining your authority, right? If you're the president of the United States, you are commander in chief. You can't have insubordinates. You can't have people not following your orders. And so Truman's going to respond by firing MacArthur. April 1st, 1951, the war is still happening. Truman's going to fire General MacArthur, and this is insanely unpopular. People in the United States are not happy about this. They think Truman is just an idiot. They cannot believe what he's doing, and so they welcome General MacArthur home. They throw him what's called a ticker tape parade, this big parade. They shut down New York City, right? All across the country, they throw multiple parades for him, but the big one is in New York City. They throw this giant parade for him. They invite him to speak to Congress. This is usually reserved for members, like dignitaries from other countries. This is not something that an American general, especially not one who gets fired for being insubordinate, gets to do. But he comes and he addresses Congress. And we don't have time right now. I want to get you done by noon, like I said. So you can go back and you can watch this. I'll post the slides in Google Classroom. But this is a video of General MacArthur's speech to Congress, where he issues this what became a famous phrase: "Old soldiers never die; they just fade away." Right? And Truman, through all of this, stays quiet. He lets the public be angry. He lets the public blame him and get mad at him. And he's quiet. And what ends up happening is that Congress launches a committee to investigate MacArthur's firing. They want to find out if Truman is pro-communist, and that's why he got rid of MacArthur. Again, this war hero, what are you thinking? How could you fire him, right? And so Truman stays quiet until this committee. During the committee hearings, a parade of witnesses come forth. They testify that limited war is the best strategy, right? So not dragging the Soviets into this war, not dropping a nuke. By the end, the committee agrees. They hear this whole line of witnesses, all these experts who all say the same thing, and they agree with Truman. They agree with these experts, and public opinion swings back to Truman, and they start supporting him again. And like MacArthur said, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. MacArthur just fades away. He's not heard from again. He dies a short time later. And he's not heard from again, right? So the war continues on without him, right? And the Soviets are going to come forward, and they're actually going to suggest a ceasefire, right? So in June of 1951, the Soviets are going to suggest that the United Nations and North Koreans declare a ceasefire and work toward an armistice, right? And so they're going to just declare a ceasefire, which is kind of informal, but we're going to agree to stop fighting and work toward an armistice, which is a formal agreement to stop fighting. Because again, somebody put it in the questions, and I've said it before, there was no declaration of war, which means you can't have a peace treaty. You don't need a peace treaty if there is no war, right? So really what you're agreeing to is you're just agreeing to stop fighting, which is an armistice, right? So they're going to declare an informal ceasefire to start working towards an armistice. That's June of 1951. Truce talks are going to begin in July of 1951. By the spring of 1952, so we're talking somewhere around April and May of 1952, almost a full year later, they have agreed to two terms. One, that they're going to establish a formal ceasefire line at the current battle line, which is the 30th parallel. So in other words, that dividing line is still going to exist. And that they're going to establish a demilitarized zone or a DMZ at the ceasefire line to divide the two halves. Somebody in the questions asked me to talk about this. Good news, it's already part of the plan. They're going to establish a demilitarized zone at that line, dividing the two halves formally. We'll take a look at it in a second. It takes them until July of 1953, okay, 2 full years before they finalize the armistice. They finally agree on how they're going to exchange prisoners in July of 1953. And so by July of 1953, the armistice is signed. It takes 2 full years to get this worked out, but they finally have it worked out. And the conclusion is this. As you can see, right, at best, we can call it a stalemate, right? As you see across the top, those are the 4 maps that you've already seen. That's the maps kind of this back and forth battle in Korea that ultimately ends up right back where it started, right? Here's a zoomed in picture of that DMZ, okay? And so here's the line. That blue line is not a waterway, it's not a river. That's the battle line. That's the 38th parallel. So this blue line in here is the same as this black line up here. The orange is the zone known as the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, right? That was that second piece that they agreed to, where basically this is unoccupied territory. This is kind of a no man's land, right? South Korea starts down here on this side of the orange. North Korea starts up here on this side of the orange. And they kind of agree to not have anybody, no citizens in here, right? Now, both have their military there. Both have the South Koreans still have United Nations soldiers there. But basically nobody, it's kind of a dead, no man's land, right? And so ultimately we have to really call this a stalemate at best, or a tie, right? Because North Korea is pushed back, communism is contained without nukes, right? We didn't have to nuke anybody. Communism didn't spread anywhere, but Korea is still divided into 2 nations. We weren't able to reunify Korea, and North Korea still exists. North Korea is still communist, right? So we didn't really push back communism, but we didn't allow it to increase. At home, we have 54,000 dead American soldiers. We've spent $67 billion on this fight in Korea. And at best, communism is contained, but it's not defeated. It's not pushed back. And so the Democratic Party receives heavy blame for this. And in the election of 1952, the Republicans are going to come out swinging. They're going to run General Eisenhower, right? The hero of World War II in Europe, better known as Ike Eisenhower. They're going to run Eisenhower against this guy named Adlai Stevenson, okay? Adlai Stevenson, the Democrat. Truman is eligible to run for president, okay? So if you remember, Truman becomes president when Roosevelt dies. He runs in 1948 and is elected for the first time on his own, which means he's still eligible to be elected again. He can be elected twice. He's in this run early. He drops out during the primaries when it becomes very clear that the country does not like him anymore. And so the final election is between General Dwight David Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. Here you can see Adlai Stevenson's campaign poster, right? Which will be safer for you? The party of Hoover, which is the Republicans. And you can see there he's got bread lines, homeless, bank closed. Because if you remember, the last time there was a Republican president, we ended up in the Great Depression, is what he's trying to say, right? But look, I've got the party of Roosevelt and Truman, where we got you higher wages, better homes, and Social Security, right? That's his platform. But ultimately, as you can see on that map above, Eisenhower is going to defeat Stevenson in a landslide. Again, he's a World War II hero. He's a Republican. This is a complete rejection of the Democratic Party. And Eisenhower is going to be the first Republican president elected since Hoover was elected in 1928. Okay, and now this is going to become a theme for the rest of our time together. These presidential campaign ads that now exist, because now we have TV. Listen to this. This is the presidential campaign for Dwight Eisenhower.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like I like I. Everybody likes I for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take I to Washington. We don't want John or Harry. Let's do that big jump right. Let's get in step with the guy that's left. Get in step with I. You like I like I. Everybody likes I for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take I to Washington. We got to get where we are going. Travel day and night for president. time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
Okay, so that concludes the lecture portion. Tomorrow we'll pick up with the Cold War at home. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording now and then stop sharing, and we can kind of take any questions and we'll wrap up.